good evening. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Mehlaka Samdani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, an organization here in the Valley that puts together events on issues related to American Muslims and other targeted communities. Our event today is part of the Rehumanizing and Restoring Relationships series that we've organized with our partners, Karuna Center for Peace Building. You will hear more from Karuna's director, Olivia Dreyer, in just a little bit. So for our series this spring, we really wanted to sort of focus on a few fundamental questions. Given the very deep and ever-deepening racial divides that our communities are afflicted with, we wanted to ask how we as a society can collectively move forward without atoning for the past and without reckoning with our past. What can we do to address the historical injustices against minority communities in our country in a way that can be effective in building intercommunal relations and restoring some of those relationships? And so, through the course of the series, we will be looking at a range of reparative mechanisms, such as the role of apology, reparations, truth and reconciliation commissions, memorials and memorializations, to see how we can use those reparative mechanisms to address existing divides. And so please, at the end of at the back of the room rather, we have our flyers that list all the events that are part of the series. So please take them as you go out and mark your calendars, because we have a few coming up in the next couple of months. So before we formally begin our event, I'd just like to make a few quick announcements. First of all, we're very grateful to Amherst Media and Jody Jenkins here, who's covering our event. So if you have any concerns around being taped or recorded during the Q&A session, please let us know, and we will make sure that you're not part of that segment. Or, I mean, if you're asking a question and would not want to be filmed, just let us know and we'll make sure that you're not recorded. Also, Edwards Church, we are in this lovely, beautiful, very sacred space, and they've been so gracious in giving us this space for free. So if you're so inclined, at the end of the event, we do have a basket for them right at the end, at the table back there. If you'd like to make any kind of donation, it would be greatly appreciated. And I believe that is it. Oh, and just finally, the structure of the event. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to have Olivia Dreyer ask our very distinguished speaker here, we'll interview him for about 45 minutes and ask him a series of questions. After that, we will break for small group discussions, and that will last for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll reconvene as a large group and engage with our speaker directly, which we hope will be a very lively Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm going to now hand it over to Olivia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie. Can you hear well? Yeah? Good? All right. So I'm Olivia Dreyer, the director of Karuna Center for Peace Building. And for those of you who don't know us, we're based in Amherst, and we do peace building in parts of the world that have been affected by violent conflict. We're in our 25th year, actually, and have worked in some 30 countries, especially focusing on reconciliation across deep divides. So this series is very close to our hearts, and though we mostly work overseas, we are starting to work in this country as well, and obviously deeply concerned about the divides here at home. So as Malika mentioned, tonight's topic, or as you've all seen, confronting our past, the roles of memorials and memorialization. So we really want tonight to get into these sort of nitty-gritty questions of how does a country go about memorializing past injustices? A past that's full of regrettable acts, shameful acts, atrocities. How do we memorialize those? And what are ways of doing it that can be healing and promote reconciliation, or how do they sometimes actually create deeper divides and deeper wounds? And so we want to look at the lessons we can draw from how other countries have grappled with this and how we can apply them to our own country. It feels so topical with, over the last couple of years, questions around public symbols of Confederacy. Should they stay and be talked about? Should they disappear? This new extraordinary memorial now in Alabama of lynchings, and sort of responses to that. So it feels like a really important time to address this topic. And we are very lucky to have resident in our valley a world expert on the subject. So Professor James Young of UMass has devoted decades of thought and study to these questions. Is this better? All right, thank you. Okay. He's devoted much thought and study to these questions, both as an academic and advising directly. He was appointed to the jury for the 9/11 memorial design. He was also on the 5-member, I don't speak German, but the Bindungskommission or something like that, for their national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews, and he's consulted with Argentina's government on its memorial to the disappeared. He's distinguished professor emeritus of English and Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at the University of Massachusetts, where he taught since 1988, founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at UMass. He's written widely on public art, memorials, and national memory, written a number of important books on the subject, has many articles, reviews, op-ed, essays in newspapers and magazines in this country and overseas as well. So we're very lucky to have you. And so again, I'm going to ask him some questions, and we hope for a lively presentation that way. We'll speak generally about memorials, about lessons learned from other countries, and then applying those to this country, and then engage you all in the rest of the evening. So, all right. So to start with, I'm just going to start really very broadly with how you see the significance of memorials and the role they play in society.
Thank you, Olivia, for a great question. I'd like to start out by saying how much I like this format of the conversation. About 5 years ago, I was also invited by the Norwegian government to come advise them on how to remember and memorialize the victims of the July 22nd, 2011 massacre by a white nationalist, white supremacist Norwegian who murdered some 77 people, including 69 children, adolescents of this little island, Utøya, in Norway. And they didn't know where to turn. It was the worst case of domestic terrorism in Europe since World War II. They realized they had no memorial tradition that would automatically create a template for remembering these children. And they knew that I had jury at the Denkmal and worked with on the 9/11 memorial jury. And so they brought me over and sat down. And they said, please tell us what to do. And I said, I'm sorry, but I didn't come to tell you what to do. I came to keep you company as we all try to figure it out together. And so it's that company and the dialogue is where answers and kind of free associations and understanding really take hold. So this kind of format is just perfect for that. I'm not here to tell everybody everything I know about memorials, but in this format, a lot of that will come out, and then I'll get to learn also from you as well. Memorials do matter. National memorials matter. Community memorials matter. There is an assumption that most memorials are appointed from on high, kind of from the top down. But the fact is, most memorials that matter most to us are local and community memorials. We have them for our families, we have them for our neighbors, we have them for victim groups, and every community needs to do it a little bit differently. So there is really no one size fits all. Of the tens of thousands of memorials in this country, most are very local. There are a few gigantic national memorials, including the truly great, I think, now in our trinity of great national memorials, the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, the brainchild of Brian Stevenson, and the Equal Justice Initiative. It's really amazing. And he talks about the ways it was inspired by the Denkmal, the National Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Europe in Germany, in Berlin, which is really interesting. So my last book was a tracing of the arc of this memorial vernacular from World War I to World War II, Holocaust, German memorials, 9/11, to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, as well as 9/11. Often communities hope that these memorials, in fact, will bring peace and consolation to the grieving, and they do that in a local way. But on a larger scale, these memorial processes often end up being very divisive, very alienating. They end up being processes in which communities end up kind of hanging all their dirty laundry out for all to see. And by the end of it, often there are 2 or 3 communities that are so disaffected by the process that they wouldn't be caught dead going back to a memorial which had lofty goals, of reconciliation and unification. But the processes themselves are often so fraught and difficult. And it's because, in fact, no memorial means one thing to everybody, as we hope and assume it. And the motives for memory, the reasons in a given time for memory, are very different over time, which led me to look at memorials over time. This is what I call the stages of memory. Established in one era by one generation, these memorials come to mean very different things for the next generation and the generation after, and we have to allow for that. And if we don't, these memorials become obsolete, kind of ossified, and really irrelevant. They don't inspire anybody to remember. All they do is make people angry. So my goal has been always to kind of rehistoricize how they came into being, which is why I do get asked a lot about the Confederate monuments, which we'll get to, I know. It's very important to remember that these so-called Confederate monuments were not actually established during the Confederacy, but they were established in the Jim Crow era as a way, in fact, to inflame. They were really meant to be signs of white supremacy. We know now. And we can't pretend that they were actually established to commemorate the innocent Confederates in any way. I've concentrated on national Holocaust memorials a lot, but not exclusively. But the hardest memorials and memorial processes were always those called to commemorate a national crime by former perpetrators trying to remember their victims. It's almost never done. So when, in the 90s, I was writing a lot about Germany's National Holocaust Memorial Problem, and they had, in fact, designated a place. They had 2 gigantic competitions. I kind of chaired the second competition, which resulted in the Peter Eisenman design. But the first competition failed. It was an open international competition, and it was kind of a disaster. It was a horrible winning design. They couldn't find consensus, but they did find something. And at that point, I was arguing more for a perpetual process and no single final solution to Germany's memorial problem. And so I was happy that it did fail, because I didn't really think it could be done. And when they asked why I didn't think it could be done, I said, what country has ever tried to reunify itself on the bedrock memory of a national crime? How does a country make central to its national memorial heritage a people murdered in the national name? Who's ever done that? And the example I used, I said, where, for example, is there even a single pebble on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to mark the slave auctions that were held there for 100 years? Right on the National Mall, right in front of the White House, right in front of Congress. Not even a rock, nothing. No country makes its national crime. In our case, our original sin, America's original sin, is surely slavery. No country makes its original sin its reason for being. Trying to reintegrate memory of this sin, which actually was a huge building block for America. Nobody had a template for it. Nobody ever done it. Countries remember their martyrdoms, their martyrs themselves as victims. They remember their divine election, perhaps, but they never remember the crimes perpetrated in their name, in the national name. And so I said these words to the German parliament in order to reassure them in a way that they were trying to do something that nobody had ever done before. You know, so where, and this is 1995, 96, 97, where is our National Memorial to African American History? It was kind of in force at that point, but wasn't built yet. And where's our Central Memorial to Slavery or to the Middle Passage? We don't have it. So I said, you're trying to do something nobody's ever done before. And you need to ask yourselves, toward what end are you doing this? Are you doing this to bury the past? Is this a way to put a big gravestone on this thing in order to move on into the 21st century? Are you doing this in order to explain German history to a new generation? How we got to where we got? How you got to where you got? Are you doing this to somehow domesticate this terrible crime? Or are you doing it to own it? You know, clearly the perpetrators aren't doing it. It's the children of perpetrators, the grandchildren of perpetrators who are backing this memorial. The then Chancellor Helmut Kohl always said that he was graced by, lived in the grace of a late birth. That is, he was born just after the Holocaust, and he was graced by that, so he didn't have to wear that burden. But von Weizsäcker, the then president, said it best in 1986. The new generation of Germans, the second generation after the war, is not responsible for the Holocaust, but it is responsible for the memory of the Holocaust. And that distinction, I think, is crucial. Our generation can always get off by saying, as many do, I'm not responsible for slavery, I wasn't even here. My family didn't come until the 20th century. No. But we were all responsible for the memory of our national sin that brought us to where we are right now. So this is, for me, these questions really go to the base of how we define ourselves nationally. And it's also meant just to distinguish between local memorials for family healing and consolation, and a nation's way of explaining itself and understanding how it came to be, and where it might go based on the national memory.
Just a couple of follow-up questions, because there was so much that was so interesting there. There was then a second time with the Germans. So that first effort failed.
The first effort failed.
Why did the second one succeed, or what was different?
It's hard to say exactly, except that I agreed to serve on a new jury. You know, after I ended up telling them, I literally told the board to stop. that I didn't think this was possible. It was possible. Nobody had ever done it before. And you're trying to do something nobody's ever done. And then I came home and I got a call from the president of the Berlin Senate, who said, precisely because you don't think it can be done, we would like to invite you to chair the next year for a new competition. I go, but you have to guarantee me that you're open to failing again. And I would agree to do this only if I could write a precis for this new competition that allows the artists who compete, artists and architects who compete for the new memorial, not to answer Germany's memorial conundrum, but to articulate and formalize the question. So I think we succeeded because we didn't ask them to answer it. If you can articulate and formalize the question through your process and create a space where people will be invited to come contemplate the crime that was committed in the national name and how we understand it and how we understand ourselves in relationship to it, then maybe you'll succeed. Or maybe we won't. We will see.
But it creates an opening.
But it opened the space for something creative, and didn't get things over-determined, and telling people what to do, but create the space where something might come.
I'm also curious, because you mentioned that the process is so important, but the ones you described were sort of competitions, for a design, but that the process itself can be so divisive. Do you find, and I imagine that's as much about the memorialization as anything, do you find yourself advising on the process?
I do, and I always hate to hear this, but I said, let the debates be part of the memorial process. Let yourselves be educated by what is so difficult about doing this. And every community hates doing that. I've been asked by communities of Boston or San Francisco, and the one in Boston, there's a Holocaust memorial in Boston, just off the Freedom Trail, and in the 80s already, they were asking me to come tell them how to run a process, to do it. But they already have their ideas. The donors, kind of wanted to recreate the Liberation Monument, in Jersey City, and put that in Boston. And I said, no, every community is going to do it differently, and your reasons for doing this are very different from those in New Jersey or New York. I think you should begin by having kind of a large set of talks and discussions and conversations like this, so that you can figure out why you're doing this. Toward what end are you going to remember the Holocaust here in Boston, near the Freedom Trail? Is this about Americanizing the Holocaust? Is it about remembering, the ease of remembering what somebody else did to somebody else overseas? Is this an avoidance of thinking about what we're not commemorating here in Boston? And so I threw all those questions out there, and it did make some uncomfortable, but I said, good, now we're getting someplace. Otherwise, we're just looking for a big old stone to put on top of the problems and move on. And so they did, and they ran a series of talks, and one of them at the Harvard School of Design was one between Maya Lin and me, in which we got to know each other very well. And this was only 6 years after the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated. And so I talked about the Holocaust memorials and how other countries do that. And she talked about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial process and how she was a senior at Yale, 21 years old. It was a very fraught, a fraught process for her. And she told me after, she said, my design is inspired partly by a World War I memorial and partly by the Holocaust memorial to the deportees in Paris, on the Ile de Cité, right next to Notre Dame Cathedral. And I said, "You're kidding?" She said, "No, that was the very first kind of negative form memorial I had ever seen. And I knew that when the time came I would create a memorial, my job was not going to be to build an obelisk or a big old rock or something hard and big and kind of towering over us, but it was going to be to create, open a space in the landscape that would open a space within us for memory." So smart and so powerful. And she did it. Yeah.
She did.
It's our, one of our greatest. And I think the Memorial in Montgomery, is right there.
Yeah.
I think the Medal of Memorial is also pretty great. But those three are what we have. And Maya kind of got it going.
Yeah. And then it seems like a really critical point you made is the need to ask the very basic question of what one's hoping to achieve with the memorial, and to really kind of tease them apart a bit. You can't hear me. I'm sorry. All right. What's that? Oh, yeah. I move around as I talk. I talk with my hands. It's very distracting with microphones. So I was just saying that it seems to me a really critical question that Professor Young raises is, what is it one hopes a memorial will achieve? And to really unpack that question, because there can be all kinds of assumptions, and probably different people have different ideas of what they hope to achieve. And I imagine just that very conversation is a really critical part of the process.
Yeah, so when you ask that question, it even comes in several parts. Toward what end politically are you building this memorial? Toward what end economically? And you gotta ask them this.
Yeah.
So, I have no economic interest. I'm not saying you do, but are you, is it a town hoping to bring tourists? When you look at the National Mall, it's full of tchotchke stands. We live in a commercial commodity culture,
Right.
whether we like it or not. And there are economic ends and means, around these memorials. Toward what aesthetic ends are you designing this memorial? Do you have an aesthetic agenda? Are you a figurative sculptor, or are you a hyper-minimalist? Are you a performance artist or an installation artist who's going to work in your medium, no matter what it is? And are you going to try to achieve something beautiful? Is that your aim?
Yeah.
Aim here? And if you are you creating beauty as a compensation for terrible loss and destruction? Or can we ever compensate and repair through a beautiful thing? And of course, the generation of contemporary artists is very resistant to redemptive memorials. You go, you must remember loss with loss, absence with absence, destruction with destruction. And you cannot justify after the fact a horrible act with a beautiful thing. And the Germans, of course, were faced with that, especially. And they were not going to make anything beautiful. And so that would be an extension of the crime. First you murder all the Jews of Europe, and then you remember them in a beautiful house. Then you create a great art object, to remember them by, and thereby somehow redeeming this mass murder. And so they were. This is why they were so paralyzed, for so long, for very good reason. And we have to ask the same questions in this country as well.
Yeah. We do want to move to this country, but before we do, can you give examples maybe from other parts of the world where monuments, memorialization has helped with healing processes or reconciliation, and maybe examples where it's had the opposite effect, or maybe it's been a mix, but and what you think some of the sort of key factors are in terms of which way it goes. I imagine it's often unpredictable, it's complicated, each context is different, but are there certain sort of general things you can pull?
Well, the Argentinians asked me, this is well after the junta leaders were gone, it was many years later, this would have been early 90s, to come and help them remember the desaparecidos who disappeared, and how to have a national competition around it. And I asked them the same questions. So why now? And the political answer was, this is a way for us to separate ourselves from the junta leadership. And I guess that's a pretty good motive, but basically you're using this process as a way to show that we didn't do it. And as a way to cast blame and to identify the guilty and thereby exculpate ourselves, as the generation that came after. So it was a pretty fraught process. And they did end up with kind of several monuments on the river, and it's interesting enough. But the process itself was a way of healing. It didn't give the families who lost loved ones all that much consolation because of all the fighting. So we just want a place where we can go mourn our dead children. We're tossed up in helicopters, or some of them are found. And others said, well, we want to have a place where we can mourn together and come together as if we were one nation. And that's always I think that's a fairly positive illusion for monuments. Creating a single space that invites people to come in and, at least seemingly for a bit, share both space and time and even perhaps the meaning of such memory together. So there is an illusion that by sharing the space, we now share the same memory. But it is an illusion. And it's what governments have always wanted to do with their national memorials and museums, kind of unite, a very diverse, polis with these single spaces. And in this age, we've just had to point out that really, as motives go, that's a pretty good one.
You called it a positive illusion.
Yeah, it's a positive illusion. But it is an illusion, and you have to remain aware that we no more share the same memories than we share the same cortex. So how about all these disparate memories being organized on a calendar or in a space in a way that seems to unify their meaning and giving them a single national meaning. And governments have always wanted this, but the more heterogeneous we get and the more diverse we are, the harder it is to perpetuate that illusion. We just have to recognize all shapes and sizes of the memories in these spaces. And maybe instead of trying to force a unified meaning on these single spaces, maybe allow these spaces to contain a multitude of understandings and meanings and people and shapes and sizes of people and ages and nationalities and languages. And so the place like the National 9/11 Memorial in New York City, the two gigantic reflecting absence, pools, the number of nations the victims came from, I believe, is 92. Victims from 92 nations were killed there. Of the nearly 3,000 victims who died on that day, 1,000 were from other countries other than the United States. And this space actually accommodates all those different people. You see and hear very few New Yorkers there. Mostly it's from all over the world and from all over this country. Because everybody kind of thought after 9/11 that it had happened to them. We now know that about 1.6 billion people around the world saw it happen live on TV. Saw the towers. And for all these people who saw it, they kind of got turned into witnesses, and they were affected viscerally, as if it did happen. There was a huge outpouring for the United States at that point. So part of our job down there was to create a space big enough to accommodate the multitudes of all the different shapes and sizes of meaning that were going to come, with these giant footprints articulated. The German case I talked about is where the Norwegian case ended up becoming very fraught when they ran a pretty great national competition. A Swedish artist won with a kind of a beautiful project called Memory Wound, in which the memorial was supposed to be located on a little peninsula on the fjord pointing out toward Utøya, the island. And he took a chunk of it out and then polished the edges of it looked like violin, cut a knife into the earth and opened it up and polished those edges and put the names. And that's what then he did on the edge. So that you can come only so far. It creates a new little island. You see the names there. And it's and then he transported all of that with the flora back to Oslo, where they would make a memorial garden at the government center. The neighbors to the island hated it. They said, no, you're accusing us somehow by wounding our landscape. This is our landscape. And we were actually in boats saving those kids, swimming up the island. And we feel accused by this. And they ended up stopping it. And the competition was nullified, and they had to go back to the drawing board. So this thing that was meant to unify became a national, very embarrassing thing for the Norwegians, who kept throwing their hands up. And eventually, we did make a nice center on Utøya up on the island, and there's a nice process in July 22, Memorial Center now at the government center in Oslo, but they're still working through what's going to happen. Okay, there. I mean, the cases in Poland are very, very complicated. In Israel, very complicated. The national aims and balancing the civic memory against private family memory. They're not always seamless. Many families, for example, will just say, well, I don't need a big memorial because we have our cemetery plot for our child. That's where we go with it. There's a memorial tradition built into the family in the church, or a synagogue. So that's where they will go to do that. But nations love nationalizing private group, as well. And there's that built-in tension. So that's why really I would hate to kind of give a blanket statement, but if I go case by case, each case reveals really interesting, unsolvable problems.
Right. It's so complex and so important. Moving to this country, I mean, you've referred to slavery as our original sin. It certainly feels that way. It is amazing that there's been no national monument to it. But sort of with sort of all this complexity, how do you think about what would be an approach to memorializing our original sin that would respond to some of these lessons learned that you've described? That one thing we noted in one of your writings, I'll just mention it, I'm paraphrasing, but it struck us. You say how to articulate, because you've been touching on it already. Okay, keep telling me, sorry. How to articulate a void without filling it in. How to formalize irreparable loss without seeming to repair it. It just seems like that's what you've been touching on especially. And, there's this great desire to sort of right the wrong in some way or bring some kind of national reckoning. And yet not doing anything seems not okay. So how do you... It's
really not okay, we know that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we weren't paralyzed for 200 years.
Right.
There were no real models. But Maya Lynn, I think, again, working through her process remember when the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was proposed, and the competition was proposed, this was a war that Americans had truly come to abhor. They treated the veterans horribly when they returned. Most of the vets from Vietnam never felt truly welcome back into this country. I was a student demonstrator myself. I didn't treat vets badly personally, but I hated the war and my revulsion over the war, got taken out on vets in policy.
Me too,
positions.
yeah.
So when this memorial was proposed, it was clearly going to be kind of by and for Vietnam veterans, hence the name. It wasn't going to be about the Vietnamese. It was going to be about the Americans who died in a war they may even have hated when they went to fight it. And that's a pretty complicated and kind of a tall order to ask of a memorial designer. Maya Lin turned out to be up to the task because her question then became how to remember a war that actually most Americans would prefer to forget. It was going to have to be a memorial that counterpointed all of the traditional self-aggrandizing, gigantic, white, neoclassic monoliths on the wall in Washington, D.C. And she knew that. This war is still a kind of a bleeding wound in our national psyche. So her answer was, it is as if I have taken a knife and sliced it into the earth and opened up a wound that can never be healed. That's pretty profound. I've never heard of a memorial that meant to wound and make a wound that would never heal. But that's what she did. And she wanted to take also that very traditional military architectonic form, the spear, the elbow, the flying wedge. And instead of this most aggressive of architectural forms, and it's the one, even the Korean War Memorial right next door, which I actually like quite a bit. I think it complements the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, is of a flying wedge of a unit, with soldier on point, the corporal on point, and then the soldiers behind him. And instead of this, she did this. She opened up the arm, the embrace. So there's the V. It's not a V for victory. It's a V for Vietnam, but it's not the point of the spear. It's the embrace of the spear that invites us down into it. And that really turned memorial thinking and design on its head. That gave a new generation of Germans a lexicon for now coming to terms with remembering something that they would rather also forget. And it broke the mold and led to what I call the generation of counter-monuments. It's America's greatest counter-monument. And then allowed them to ask these questions of German history. But I think she thereby opened the door to reconsidering how to remember things in our history that we don't like remembering, that we're not proud of. Usually commemorate the great triumphs and victories and points of pride, but never those terrible. How do you articulate ambivalence? How do you remember something you'd rather forget? And you do so, I think, by problematizing it, counterpointing the traditional illusions of monumentality with counter-monumentality, and instead of making something fixed and gigantic and overweening that makes us feel small, you create something humanly proportioned. Not a 300-foot tower, but here a wall that you see your own reflection in. She arranged the names, not alphabetically like a telephone book, but she arranged the names of the soldiers in the order in which they fell in battle, thereby re-embedding these names in historical time, real time. All things that we had not been doing, before, which she did. And so she really did spark a generation of memorial designers, including eventually Bryan Stevenson. And surely she would be framing, she made the Civil Rights Memorial. She designed, actually, this beautiful water table, with black marble granite water table, with the names of civil rights leaders who were murdered, and circling down, and the water running down. So she's very good at using water.
How would you see the Bryan Stevenson Memorial in light of what you're just describing?
So I love so much about it, it's hard to know where to begin. It came
Does
from...
everybody, maybe just, I don't want to assume everybody knows what it is, so maybe you...
I brought the Times carried this gigantic picture of it last April, almost a year ago, on the opening. It's truly spectacular, and horrifying.
Can you just say what it is in case somebody doesn't,
These are about 1,000, actually it might be 1,800 steel stelae, which are suspended from the roof of this hall. You walk underneath them. You slowly descend underneath them. So you're actually at eye level with them at one point, and they're kind of humanly proportioned. A little bit humanly proportioned the way that tombstones are, but whereas tombstones are planted in the earth, these are suspended, obviously, to echo lynching victims hanging from trees on the one hand, but also on the other, anchoring these swinging, moving tombstones in the heavens, which is quite...
I just want to make sure that everybody knows that it's a memorial to the lynching.
To the lynching victims of lynching. He has also replicated each one of these, put them in gigantic piles with the county. This is the number of counties in which these lynchings occurred over like a 100-year period. And has invited every county where they have one of these waiting for them to come pick it up and to install it somewhere in their county that they'd like to own it.
At EGI's expense.
Yeah, and they'll pay for it. So anything that is there with the county on it means that they have not claimed it.
Wow.
Pretty amazing. And it invites you to come claim it and find a space for it in your county where you can put it in front of, maybe at the site of the lynching, put it in town hall. But that it initiates your process.
Yeah.
Whereby you come to own this part of your town's history, whether you like it or not, and understand how to move forward with this memory. Not have it paralyze us, not deny it any longer. Not close it off or foreclose the process, but to begin the process. So this is truly a mobile memorial in that way. It's dispersive, which I love. It does move. These do kind of sway in the wind a little bit. Completely haunting. And of course, on the grounds is the memorial, so a museum as well to the history of this injustice and lynching in America. He gives credit, even in this New York Times article, to the Denkmal, of all things, in Berlin. The Stele, the 2,711, excuse me, which are located from ground height up to about 8 or 9 feet tall in this kind of waving field in Berlin. He liked how underdetermined they were, how blank they were, how they seemed to be moving, how they were animated. And so he does what all great artists do. He's informed by what comes before. This, the deckball design was inspired in some ways by Myron. The underdeterminedness of it all. Eisenman credits might have been, and all the German counter-monument makers as well. So that's some of that arc.
Yeah.
And Brian Stevenson, it's very rare that somebody just has this, an inspiration, a brainchild like this, and brings it to fruition. And that he did it in the cause of equal justice. And he says, equal justice, in this case, is achieved partly by memory. Not completely achieved, but part of it is achieved by remembering and re-owning what has to be yours. So he's pretty remarkable, and he's kind of my hero.
Yeah, extraordinary. We're going to move into small groups in just a minute, but before we do, I would like you to just touch on the controversy around Confederate memorials and varying views of should they all disappear, should they stay, and there can be discussions around them. What are your thoughts?
The debates, I think they should be handled locally. That there is no one-size-fits-all solution. You don't destroy them all, you don't keep them all up. But every town that hosts one and that makes it a part of their civic life needs to address it. And some will knock them down. Some will leave the plinth standing, the statue gone. Some will make a museum, either a civil rights museum or a Civil War museum, and put it there and explain why it was put there in 1924, so, 80 years after the Civil War, why it was put there in 1960, or why it was there really during Reconstruction, if it went that far back. And tell the stories of how they came into being, and why on this date, in this era, the town decided it could no longer make these a focus of their public life. And they had to address it as a way to teach history maybe to a new generation, or as a way to begin to own the reasons these originally were put up and to be transparent about it, now. So I think if that approach is taken, every community will figure it out. Mm-hmm. It won't be easy, but as you know, I'm not for being easy. They should suffer a little bit. It's okay.
Yeah.
And work them through. They're doing the same thing now in South Africa. Obviously, and I did several talks there last year. They took me to the national memorials that they're trying to figure out what to do with them. They've already carted several of them off and created their own little museums of these memorials, describing who these people actually were. Yeah. How they were. The great benefactors of apartheid, and in many cases the makers of apartheid policy, and we need to do the same here, and that is a counter-monumentality. We might even some community might even decide to create a counter-monument to confront, leave that one standing, and then put up its counter, and create a dialogue between them.
They can all be prompts.
Let them be creative. Let them respond creatively and not sweep it under the carpet.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it's all about what allows us to start to have the conversations we need to have, and the difficult conversations we need to have. And memorials can prompt those in many different ways.
Because if you do just plow it under as if it never happened, that's a whitewash. So leave some remnant and then tell the story of how it came into being, how it came undone, and how we get from here to there. And let that be now what it remembers. And another generation, there might be another layer of understanding, and commentary to where it makes more sense to the next generation. That wasn't there.
Well, we do want to give some time for you to talk to each other and formulate some questions then, or insights, comments to share with the larger group.
I see a hand in the back, I'm not sure.
Well, I think what we'll do is we find it works really well to have people just for 10 minutes talk to each other. I think it would be great to really focus in on our own original sin, our history of slavery, and how do we think, and the legacy of it. The lynchings are part of that legacy, its impact to this day. How do we memorialize that, taking into account the things that we've been discussing? So maybe just turn and face a couple of the people in the pew behind you, or whatever makes sense, to just form little groups of 4 or 5, just to get some conversation going and thoughts going, and then afterwards we'll pull the questions.
As a result of the small groups, I think we can now begin to have our larger Q&A session. So who would like to go first?
Thank you. Not ashamed of that. So my name is Cheryl Dunes. I work at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I was there when you were there. You're no longer there. I'm still there. I live in Buckland, which is a small town full of white people. And in terms of this conversation regarding memorial, I find it very interesting that within the United States of America, our original sin actually is not the enslavement of African people. It is actually the colonization of the North American and South American, actually all of the territories inhabited by indigenous peoples. That was the first original sin. And then the enslavement of African and indigenous peoples, which tends to be forgotten. And so I find it very challenging to have a conversation about the memorialization of the enslavement of African people and indigenous peoples when we in this country don't actually know what our history of enslavement of African and indigenous peoples is. And on top of that, it hasn't stopped. And on top of that, these conversations happen in these kind of spaces where the people's names are not mentioned because we don't know what they are, because they were not recorded, because the enslavement of African and Native peoples didn't just happen in the South. Why, they happened here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts before it was a Commonwealth. It was a colony, and Massachusetts was the first colony to enslave African people and indigenous peoples. And so we wind up having conversations about Confederate memorials without actually having conversations about what happened in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts before it was a Commonwealth. And so, I know this is not a question, because we need to have context for the question. And as somebody who went to the Legacy Museum a memorial and found a pillar with her family's name on it, makes it a little personal. And yet, we are in these spaces full of white identified people having these conversations 4 steps removed from actually having it be personal because we're victims of lynching, when in fact the other side of that incident never seems to claim the people who did it, which would be the European white folks, who, if race is a social construct, why do we never talk about the social construct of white people? And so my question is, how can we begin to have this conversation when we don't even know what our history is, because the history is recorded by, dun, 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 wait for it, white people. So that's my question. So how can we remember something when the people who recorded the something that is remembered were the people who documented it, who were the people who actually did it?
So you ask the question beautifully and begin to answer it by starting that conversation, exactly that conversation. The hosts of the panel tonight created a space for us to come together to ask the questions, even when they're uncomfortable questions and difficult. And these are the kinds of questions that, as historians, we've long asked of ourselves, and we're not very good at answering them, because the answer is that as long as the so-called victors of history, the persecutors are the ones left around at the end of these events, they will always be the ones who write that history. You're exactly right. The parallels also of recorded history during World War II, of course, the Sinti and Roma, so-called gypsies, underwent also a mass racial extermination at the hands of the Nazis. The numbers aren't even fully known because, in fact, their historical tradition was an oral one, so there were no written records left. The stories of their suffering and their experiences basically died in their throats. So by killing them, the Nazis effectively killed the history. Jews who were murdered left voluminous notes, records. It's kind of a literary culture. And if your culture is an oral culture, these stories die in the throats of the victims. And I think we need to be wrestling with all these questions in the space, in the classroom, in our works. So, as you put it so eloquently, one really adds to the next. We can't nullify these sets of questions with our preoccupation around these other questions. We need to keep adding these questions to each other. And that raises one of the other problems of memorials. Every time something is remembered, something is also forgotten. So we need to add memory to each other and not use memory actually as a way to close another memory or take away somebody else's voice. But these spaces need to be open so that this memory adds to that memory, adds to this one, and more understanding that comes with that, as opposed to one voice taking the place of another voice. We need to add the voices together. Thank you for your question.
Can you give an example, and I'm sure this of when you said in the South, Confederate-based memorials were actually raised during Jim Crow years. So when we were talking in our small group, I think it would be really great that it was obvious and dated, that the dates are added, that was erected in 1950 something or 19, because it would be like, well, who would do that, right at that time. Can you give examples? And are the dates when they were actually erected there? So it doesn't look like it was erected in, 1866? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't think they were ever actually designed to make them look like they were erected during that era, but clearly by taking the icons of the Confederacy, or taking the so-called heroes of the lost cause and turning them into icons 50 years later, really was a way actually to, not just to invoke, but to plant the kind of the white supremacist stake, and to throw it in the faces of all who would now look for equal treatment, vote, everything else. So I suppose I'd be curious, for example, if the Charlottesville statue, exactly what its date or provenance was. Do you know?
No, but the Robert E. Lee in New Orleans, we were there 3 or 4 years ago before they took it down, and I looked at that plaque, and it was put up in the 40s.
In the 40s, yeah. So, these are memorials that really as much to Jim Crow era white supremacy than they are to Civil War.
I'm just going to say that's the same with our holidays, our national holidays. They come at times that are disconnected from the very holiday. Columbus Day, Civil Rights Movement, Thanksgiving, post-Civil War, ways to reunite a country that's divided.
Sure.
So let's invent a holiday. And we got one coming up in Massachusetts and the nation for the landing of the Pilgrims. The first Thanksgiving, right?
Yeah, they
see how that
are pretty interesting. The way that the calendar repeats itself does create the illusion that the so-called original meaning of that day gets repeated as well.
Right.
There seems to be something very natural about it, like stones in the landscape, as if God put them there somehow. But the day on the calendar is a very natural, almost God-appointed day, because the Earth goes around the sun, and it seems to be part of the natural cycles.
So, as an adult child of Holocaust survivors, I've been to lots of memorials. And I recently went to Montgomery last month. And I was moved in a way I had never been moved by any other memorial. But I had two really powerful reactions while I was there. One was, I'm sick of memorials. I don't want us to have to build any memorials. I want us to fix society. And sort of piggybacking on that is, what is the responsibility for people who visit these kinds of memorials? I mean, we're bearing witness to something, and I read an article that somebody sent me recently that said, it's a desecration. I didn't agree with it, but they said it was a desecration of the memory of the people that are being memorialized when, like, busloads of white people come and they go and they check it off. You go to Montgomery and there's like 20 different places you can go visit, and then you get back on the bus and you go home. And what do you do with it? And then I remember being in Germany, in Berlin, at the memorial and seeing children playing on the blocks and everything. So I guess my question is, where does the responsibility about bearing witness come in? And are memorials sort of just part of the process? And what do we do with what we see?
Well, your question echoes a German generation's great skepticism of memorials generally. And one of the reasons that they make so many disappearing memorials and invisible memorials, there's a real there's a real fear in the younger generation that instead of actually doing something, we make memorials instead. So we've got this picture of President Clinton in the White House and Elie Wiesel opening the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Elie Wiesel stops during the middle of his speech on the dedication in 1993 and says, "But Mr. President, before I go on, I have to tell you that I can't sleep at night for what my eyes have seen in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mr. President, you must do something to stop the genocide of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Muslims of Bosnia and Herzegovina." And I remember watching it on TV and seeing President Clinton's eyes moisten and his jaw clench. And then I heard him say something he didn't say, but I heard him say, "But Elie, I am doing something about Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm here with you remembering the Holocaust." That is, that he got it exactly upside down. And making memorials as a substitute for action or intervention, or as a substitute for equal justice, is, I think, an extension of the crime being committed. And I think that's a huge issue, and this is why I love Ryan Stevenson's approach. The memorial and museum are part of the art toward justice. It's an action, and he's not doing it unless we visit it, or unless people visit it by the busload, and then they see it and they get out and they go, "Okay, I've done my part now," or, you know, "My visit ends here," and that they aren't inspired to work for equal justice. You know, the Equal Justice Initiative is an initiative that needs to be picked up by all visitors. Otherwise, it really dies on the vine right there. And so that returns the burden of memory and the burden of responsibility for remembering back to the visitors who come. And maybe every visitor needs to be asked, how are you going to live your life differently now? And how are you going to move and intervene, you know, toward achieving equal justice because of this visit you've made right here. Joschka Fischer made this point around the Denkmal in Berlin in 1999 when Germany joined NATO forces for the very first time since World War II and flew its planes off of German soil to bomb the Serbs in Kosovo to prevent a certain genocide of Kosovar Albanian Muslims, the very last non-Christian population in Europe about to be wiped out by the Serbs. And it was clear what was going to happen. NATO finally responded. Clinton did actually motivate and pull NATO together, and they did push the Serbs out, and it's still a mess, but they did stop. And he very clearly said, building a Denkmal is nothing if we don't act on it. And therefore, I'm going to amend the German Constitution and allow our Air Force to leave German soil for the first time since World War II in order to prevent a new and certain genocide of the last non-Christian population. So the responsibility has to come back to us. You're right, thank you. If memory becomes a substitute for doing, then we really lost.
I'm just struck by several levels of this because there's a way in which memorials can have this sort of museum-like quality but what was interesting to me about your description of the one in Alabama is this, they hang there, those pillars hang for a county to take one home. So there's an implicit call to action.
Yes.
And
it's a finger.
There's a whole pile.
A finger of shame, and it's very visible, those counties that haven't. So that's a very different
How
kind
many
of...
Massachusetts counties have been mentioned there? Going back to
Right. Well, that's another...
Because part of it is what Cheryl was talking about.
Yeah.
When the history is recorded by the perpetrators, we don't have a complete history. So that particular research has yielded over 4,400 people who were lynched, not just by hanging, and that's the ones that research has found that they can evidence.
Right.
So they're all over the country. I mean, we see a concentration obviously in the South because of the internal enslavement of people of African descent, but our crimes are not on that particular map. New York, yes.
Northeastern University has a department that is doing research on exactly this.
Good.
But, and we have actually invited some of their members to actually speak on this panel, but they weren't available, but that was our hope. Yes, so there was a question here.
Yes, we're actually related. Our group was wondering if there are any efforts in the Northeast or northern of Mason in states that were colonies that were to memorialize or to reinterpret history, to talk about the complicity of the North in the domestic and international slave trade and cotton industry, all of the ways that the North was complicit in.
In a typically self-aggrandizing way, New Englanders like to think of themselves as all having been abolitionists somehow. And that's become part of New England ideology, even, which is to deny the role New Englanders, like Europeans, settlers, played in the slave trade. And as I suggested before, we've got all kinds of templates for remembering the great things we did, and our great heroism, and our great victories and triumphs and our martyrdoms, but no template for integrating our national crimes. And we're just finding those models now. And Maya Lin, I think, broke the wood, and German artists have now begun doing it. And now we've got Museum in Montgomery, and so when will a county in Massachusetts actually own its, its Stella, its gigantic, steel bar? Maybe that's what we need to ask right now. And maybe we need to do that. And how do we own it? And what do we do with it? How do we act? How do we live with it? And how do we go on? How do we pass this legacy down to the next generation? All become part of the questions. So maybe from here tonight, we find those Massachusetts counties and names and see what we can do to own them. Apparently, none of them have been claimed.
Not a single Stella has been claimed.
Yeah, so
But the thing is, my memory is that as far as the north, that it went as far north as New York, but he didn't have any counties in Massachusetts. And it went as far north as Colorado.
Michigan. Went to Michigan, Montana,
Rhode
Oregon.
Island.
The East and Colorado.
And I believe that the memorials have not been taken yet because the museum has to be open a full year before the invitation to take your memorial into your community and place it on civic soil can happen. So the museum or the memorial hasn't been open a year yet. So that's why my understanding of why none of them have been taken yet. And there are many counties already working to bring theirs home.
I think there's a condition for that, though, that
There
for
are
the
conditions.
counties to be able to bring it home, you have to show that the county as a whole has been working towards racial justice and has been actually taking steps to advance that before you're allowed to take it home. So I think that's also a process that's, but yes, sir.
I want to bring in another kind of a sidebar here, and that is the biggest monuments have always been built by the weakest dictators. Ceausescu in Romania, and so on and so on. So to me, one dimension of monuments is always that they interfere in the present to make something that is weak look stronger. And that's often a lie. The very investment deflects from the doubts that people have about the government and so on. And from that, there's a sliding, it's a continuous range to monuments that actually bring out something that was forgotten and is presently used still to subjugate the wrong kinds of people and so on. And it's tough when a monument is in the process of construction to know what is not commemorated in that place that could be commemorated, what should be commemorated, and who is doing the investing. Who has all the money to build these monuments?
I think you voiced the kind of suspicion all of us have about memorials and monuments and why the new generations began to redefine them. Usually the most authoritarian regimes, for example, are the ones that fetishize monuments most. And for many young Germans, the monument to commemorate the victims of fascism in a fascist form of architecture and art was just non sequitur. It made no sense to them at all, and they wanted to find another vocabulary for it. Maya Lin wanted to take maybe the traditional militarized architectural form of that, spear, that elbow, that point, but then she inverted it. It brought us into its embrace instead, and that was a great way to take that and then turn it, to counterpoint it, to turn it on its head. And I think that's where we are right now. And not to say that we can prescribe what it's going to be in 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, but if we see it in this arc, I think we're working on it. And to kind of disabuse the monument of its pretensions to eternal permanence, perpetuity, or anything but that. We know that most monuments last about as long as the generation that built them.
The stumbling stones in Germany
are fantastic.
A wonderful example of what you were talking about.
I guess I have a comment or a question about, again, museums. I'm a docent at the Springfield History Museum, which has a collection of motorcycles and old cars, but there is a room in there that's a Civil War memorial. There's John Brown. It's kind of sacred ground when I'm up there. I'm up there with third graders. There's John Brown's desk. John Brown hung out in Springfield for a while. There's a small painting of the black troops that volunteered for the Massachusetts regiment that went down south to fight in the war. And I always walk through there while we're going to look at motorcycles and things like that. The third graders come there for an hour and a half, and then they go over to the Science Museum, and the funding is by Smith & Wesson. Well, Springfield is an armory town. It was founded by the armory because George Washington said, build an armory there, and it's got technology because of that. And that's the question. There's museums here. How do we turn these somewhat sacred hidden spaces into what is our valley about, and where is the oppression that continues? There are these hidden away little treasures that can be teased out.
So let's just keep teasing them out. Opening up the spaces where we get to talk about them, and we kind of return the genealogies of these spaces also to public history, so that where they came from and where they're going are all kind of embraced, and we're not pretending they just got planted there by God.
I want to appreciate you for what you've shared and how much we've learned. And it's feeling very emotional to me because my father was a survivor of the Armenian genocide by the Turkish people and was born in Turkey during the genocide and fled to this country. And because the genocide is denied by Turkey and by this country, how we would love to have some memorials
how we would love to have our history known, memorialized, recognized, admitted, and it's just really painful. And I've been to Armenia and seen the commemorations there, but they're not a big deal, and they're not very well visited, and they're not very visible. And so it's just, so it would be wonderful to, have some memorials for our people. But the other thing I'm thinking about, besides the missing memorials to the Armenians, the other thing I'm thinking about is when you said that building memorials, it causes controversy and divides communities, and there's often difficulty. And I was in the inner core team that led the effort to build the statue to Sojourner Truth in Florence. And we started that effort in 1992, and it took 10 years, raising $250,000. And you're right, it divided the community. This community fought and had difficulty, and meetings in Florence were real hard, meetings in this room were hard. People didn't want the statue to go up, and it just was a long 10 years of meeting and listening and convincing, and we thought when we started it, this was just going to be who could object? We thought it would be just a shoo-in, and it was years of meeting with people and educating people about who she was and why, and where she lived and why it should go up. But there was a lot of resistance, and it was just what you said, it was a tough time. And the statue's up, and it's wonderful, and the unveiling was wonderful, and many people have visited, but it was not an easy decade getting that memorial statue up.
So the difference between the Turkish official policy of denying that there was, an Armenian genocide, at the hands of Turks, is very different from, let's say, the American policy decision not to call it a genocide, because in naming something a genocide, that triggers policy decisions and things that they have to do in retaliation. But clearly, historians around the world, the consensus is, overwhelming, that such a genocide took place, and how it took place, and we know really all the details. There's an interesting follow-up to the Denkmal debates in Germany. Good friends of mine, Michael Rothberg and Yasmin Yildiz, who is actually Turkish German. Michael Rothberg is an American Jewish professor at UCLA now. Worked on memory of the Holocaust in the Turkish German community and Muslim community in Germany. And here they are being told, if you need, one of the ways that you become a good German is to integrate the mass murder of Jews into how you understand your Germanness. And they're telling a Turkish Muslim this, who's now immigrated to the country, and for many years wasn't even allowed to become a German. So they have now learned what it means to tell this terrible, against the grain history in Germany, and they're taking this now back to Turkey, and are now introducing it into curriculum. It's being resisted by the government, and right now with Erdogan, nothing like this is going to happen. But these are Turkish, many of them third or fourth generation Turkish Germans who are now returning to live in Turkey, and now they become Holocaust educators on the one hand, but also educators of the Armenian genocide in Turkey on the other. So let's hope, and pray for the success of the next generation.
Well, I also appreciate very much your presentation. I learned a lot, and this may be presumptuous to say, but I wondered if you would change your introduction as the original sin being the enslavement of people to including our coming over and genocide of the Native American people. And a kind of question in this is that what is it in the European America that made have with introducing slavery. It's kind of like, whoa.
That's a pretty large question. Which is one of the reasons, I mean, I do agree that it's actually, I guess even the term original sin is maybe not the best term to use because of its theological implications on the one hand. But thinking of the way that this country was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, it became a part of this country's engine in this weird way, which is why I call it America's, original sin. I mean, there's something very American. All the European, and I have to say, not just European, but all the great imperial dynasties, including China, Japan, their job was to go out and colonize. And so colonization was just what countries who could did. Going way back, not just to the 16th century or 15th century, but way back before that, on the subcontinent in Asia, on the Asian continent and the Japanese. It's what imperial, we lose track, but that's why imperial dynasties existed. It's to swallow up and to colonize and to civilize and to Christianize in some cases. And to Romanify, and that's what they did. So I wouldn't want to distinguish. I just don't want that sin, which is a sin. But if everybody did it, it's not ours, and it becomes Romanized in this weird way. But the American exceptional project of enslaving Africans, on the soil for just 300 years is something different from that project.
Yeah, maybe just to add to, I think, several points that have been made tonight, as we think of memorialization as a way of confronting our past. I mean, I'm finding myself thinking a lot, listening about how do we confront what we did to indigenous populations. And we're living, we were talking about, thinking about what happened in this valley. Well, my goodness, a lot happened in this valley in that regard. And there have been these little things like the Lord Jeff abandoning its name as the Lord Jeff, and now it's called Boltwood something or other. These sort of.
But we still live in a town called
But
Amherst.
we still live in a town called Amherst, exactly, with Amherst College. So, ultimately, it's really not about Lord Jeff. It's about deepening our understanding of what actually happened on this soil, whether we come from other parts of the country or not. Here we live, and to me, I'm thinking tonight, my gosh, what an opportunity to actually delve in and understand what happened right here. And what kind of memorialization would open those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, it's much easier to talk about what the others are doing than it is to think and look inward and what our responsibilities are right here.
Yeah.
Do we get rid of Amherst, the name, or thereby whitewashing it and taking him out of history, or do we actually deal with it and tell the history and make it very clear that we are where we are today because of that history.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and
Well, I was just wondering if symbols are like memorials in a way too, and there is this new effort to change the symbol on the state flag of Massachusetts, which is the Native American with, the broadsword with a white hand over his head. So would that fit into your awareness of...
It takes activists like you and us to do it. But it's kind of like where to begin. which one? Do we make a triage list? Sometimes you just have to jump in and divvy things up and start wherever you need to, and the rest will follow.
We have to remember that it was a 5th grade class in Amherst, Massachusetts, that got the arrow out of the Pilgrim hat on the I-90 and on the Mass Pike, on the Turnpike.
Yeah,
on the Turnpike.
They were 3rd graders when they started, 5th graders when
they
it
won.
happened.
And they got the arrow out of the Pilgrim hat.
Fort River School
3rd
in
graders to
Amherst.
5th graders, and they won. They got the arrow out of the hat. Gotta love that.
I was thinking.
That was years and years ago.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your conversation and encouraging all of us to talk about this. Thank you, Dr. Young. And thank you all for coming out tonight. We really enjoyed your questions. We really appreciated your challenges to this conversation. That's what makes this worth it. That's why we're here. And so thank you so much. And I want to just give you some advance about our upcoming events. On April 3rd, we have right here in the same room, we'll have Righting Wrongs, the Role of Apology and Reparations for Slavery. This is with Dr. Theodore Johnson and Dr. Ali Aslan. That'll be a great conversation. And then on May 7th, we have Dawnland, a documentary about cultural survival and stolen children, and to go back to the indigenous community and Native Americans in this country. That film follows the true story of the forced removal of Native American children from their homes and the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission formed in response in the U.S. This will take place actually at Amherst Cinema, so we'd really love to have you there. And also I want to just give a plug for Critical Connections Facebook page, also criticalconnections.org is our website, and we have a new Twitter page that we're trying to get up and running. So follow us at Crit Connections. Thank you so much and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.